Disney bought Marvel for $4 billion. But do you know who made the first offer? It wasn't Disney. Ike Perlmutter, widely known as Marvel Entertainment's former CEO and board chairman, didn't want to sell. Yet he shaped the entire course of the negotiation with a single sentence he said at the outset. And Disney never, ever escaped that frame.
And this is no coincidence. When I first heard this, I thought immediately of Galinsky and Mussweiler's 2001 research, which measured the correlation between the first offer and the final deal at 0.85. In other words, the first number placed on the table in a negotiation pulls the outcome toward it with something close to physical force. Perlmutter didn't apply this instinctively. He applied it as a deliberate strategy.
But there's a crack right here. I spent years inside real business negotiations, and the vast majority of the best negotiators I knew did the exact opposite. They said, get the other side talking first. That can't be a coincidence. Why do field practice and academic research say the complete opposite?
Because they're describing different conditions, and that distinction changes everything. In my view, resolving this paradox means having the most valuable piece of information at any negotiation table.
Agreed. And by the time you're done with this video, 3 things will have shifted. First, you'll see why the first offer is such a powerful weapon and how it can simultaneously become a trap through both research data and real case analysis. Second, you'll read the behind the scenes of the Disney-Marvel negotiation alongside anchor theory. Third, at your own table, whether it's a B2B sale, an investment discussion, or a business deal, you'll know exactly when to speak first and when to stay silent.
If this kind of analysis adds value to you, the like button directly determines how many decision makers this channel reaches. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time.
Welcome to the Insight Atlas. Let's start the anchor paradox. Does the first speaker win? Classic sales training says, wait for the other side to speak first. Find out their price expectations, then take your position. I defended this view myself for a long time. The logic is simple. Dropping an anchor without information traps you on the wrong ground.
But the research data doesn't support that view. 3 separate experiments by Galinsky and Mussweiler showed the party that makes the first offer shapes the final deal in their favor. Correlation 0.85, meaning the outcome tracks the direction of the first number.
Hold on. Let's make that concrete. Is a 0.85 correlation really that strong? I've seen in many negotiations that when the first offer is framed wrong, the other side walks away from the table. Economic gain versus risk of impasse. How do you weigh the two?
The 2025 meta-analysis answers this question directly. 374 effect sizes, 90 studies, 16,344 participants. Yes, ambitious first offers increase economic value, but they also increase the risk of impasse and the other party's dissatisfaction. So speak first isn't a guaranteed win. It's a conditional weapon.
And right here is exactly where I diverge from the researchers. In field practice, that condition is so decisive, it feels like we're talking about 2 completely different games. So why is the mechanism itself so powerful? What's happening in our brains?
Selective accessibility. The moment a reference point is given, the brain selectively brings forward information consistent with that point. The instant the other party says $500,000, the buyer's mind activates the question, what makes this worth $500,000? If they'd said $200,000, the exact opposite would have kicked in. The other party is unconsciously searching for evidence that confirms the first number.
I've lived this in practice many times. The moment you learn a competitor's price in a negotiation, you find yourself arguing around that number. Even objecting to their number reinforces it because you keep repeating it. Harvard's Guhan Subramanian illustrates this perfectly with his simulation. A student spent most of a negotiation exercise trying to prove that a wage of $10.69 per hour was completely unacceptable. When the exercise ended, the deal had closed at exactly $10.69. Objecting had reinforced the anchor. That's exactly the issue of accepting the frame. The moment you object to a number,
You've endorsed it as the center of the discussion. The real question is, how do you change the frame?
We'll come back to that. But first, let's be clear on why speak first and win doesn't hold in every situation.
Because in field reality, information asymmetry changes everything. An anchor you drop without knowing what the other party truly expects will either trap you with a ceiling that's too low or send the other party walking. I call this a blind anchor. And over the years, I've seen that blind anchors win something in the short run and lose the relationship in the long run.
I fully agree. And that blind anchor risk maps exactly onto the impasse finding in the meta-analysis. Now let's get to the case, because Perlmutter was someone who had calculated all of these risks.
2009. Bob Iger wants to acquire Marvel for Disney. But before a single number is discussed, the anatomy of an anchor begins to take shape through the man sitting across the table, Ike Perlmutter, an Israeli army veteran whose photograph has almost never appeared in public, and who ousted two billionaires, Ron Perelman and Carl Icahn, from the company during its bankruptcy period. Iger spends 6 months trying to reach him. No response.
We can't overlook the first move Iger makes here. He finally gets a meeting and walks into Perlmutter's office alone. No corporate team, no lawyer, no CFO. To me, this is the most critical strategic decision of the entire negotiation. Why?
Trust building, but simultaneously a power signal. Iger later writes, "If I couldn't make him feel he was dealing with someone genuine and honest, I'd never convince Perlmutter. If I'd gone with a corporate army, his defenses would have gone up immediately."
I read it another way too. Going alone also says, I take this deal seriously enough to set corporate protocol aside. That's an empathy signal, but at the same time a message. I came to understand you, not to buy you. And for someone like Perlmutter, that message lowers the guard.
Absolutely. So how does the price offer come to the table?
This is where Perlmutter runs one of the oldest plays in the book. He leads with, I don't want to sell. That's a phantom anchor. Is it genuine? Tactical? I think it's both. But its effect is this. It drops Disney into the position of the party trying to convince. And the party trying to convince loses the frame in a negotiation.
Then Perlmutter states his position. The share price should start with a 5, meaning $50 or above, and payment should be largely in stock for tax optimization. Disney initially refuses flat out. A few days later, Disney comes back and agrees to Perlmutter's terms. A $50 share price. Exactly that frame.
Here's what I want to ask. Did Disney fail to break that anchor? Or did they choose not to? Because Iger's strategy was built around building a relationship with Perlmutter, and preserving that relationship was worth more than winning the price war. Maybe Disney consciously accepted the anchor.
That's a very important distinction. Galinsky's research shows exactly this dynamic. There's an inverse relationship between the economic value of a deal and the other party's subjective experience. The most aggressive anchors produce the best economic outcomes, but the other party feels more dissatisfied. With a long-term partnership in mind, Iger may have consciously chosen the satisfaction side.
And that decision proved to be right. Perlmutter continued to run Marvel within Disney. The strength of that relationship contributed far more to Marvel's value over the following decade. So looking back, $4 billion was an extraordinarily low price.
Yes, and according to Variety's detailed reporting, the two central points of contention in the negotiation, share price and payment structure, were both conditions Perlmutter had set from the start. Disney said unacceptable, then accepted. The anchor held.
Let's address the practitioner-researcher paradox directly. If both are right, what's the answer? Research says speak first, but negotiations in research settings are fundamentally different from real-world business negotiations. In a lab, participants don't truly know what they stand to lose. In the field, the person at the table really loses.
I understand that objection, but the researchers anticipated it. One of Galinsky's experiments was conducted through a real chemical plant transaction. Participants were working with real money. The correlation still came out at 0.85. So the lab effect argument doesn't invalidate this research.
All right, I accept the strength of the research. But my real objection is this. When we say speak first, who exactly are we talking about?
A negotiator with a strong alternative, well-prepared, psychologically calm, or someone boxed in, anxious, with no options? Those are two completely different people.
That's exactly what Meravi and Heller's 2021 research found. They call it the practitioner researcher paradox. Buyers with weak alternatives who are also anxious, when they make the first offer, they quote numbers below their own expectations. They would have gotten a better outcome by speaking second.
Exactly. So when researchers say speak first, win, they're actually saying speak first if you're in a position of strength, win. But they don't emphasize that enough. I've seen it in the field. A boxed-in CFO saying, we're offering $500,000, most of the time means we're telling you we've hit our ceiling.
Agreed. And let me add a research dimension to that. Anxiety pushes numbers down. An anxious negotiator, afraid of being rejected, quotes a safe number, meaning they're anchoring against themselves. This is why the practitioner advice of stay quiet is really saying, don't let your anxiety and weakness bleed into the price.
Yes, and that brings up a third option we need to talk about: setting the frame instead of dropping an anchor. In other words, defining the axis the negotiation will turn on without quoting a number. That's what Perlmutter did. He said, I don't want to sell. That's not a price, it's a frame. It dropped Disney into the position of the party that has to convince.
The literature calls this a phantom anchor. The Harvard negotiation program describes it this way. I was thinking of selling this car for $8,000, but I can do $6,500 for you. $8,000 was never formally offered, but it shapes the appeal of $6,500. Perlmutter's reluctance served exactly that function.
And let me add, setting the stage for a phantom anchor requires far more valuable information than any price figure. It requires knowing the other party's real motivation. Once Iger understood why Perlmutter didn't want to sell, he didn't want to retire, he loved Marvel, he used that knowledge to build the frame.
This connects to the most underappreciated finding in Galinsky and Mussweiler's research. Actively thinking about the other party's alternatives or motivations significantly weakens the anchoring effect. So the same skill that enables you to set an anchor also enables you to break one, truly understanding the other party.
Now let's get to the most overlooked detail at the negotiation table: how you say the number. I've noticed in many negotiations, two people quote the same figure, but one's offer gets taken seriously while the other gets challenged immediately. Why?
Mason and Ames's 2013 research from Columbia Business School gives a clear answer. Negotiators who use round numbers get larger counteroffer steps from the other side. Those who use precise figures, like $487,500, are perceived as both more competent and better prepared, so the other party responds more cautiously, with smaller steps.
Let me say that in field language. A round number says, here's my position, let's negotiate. A precise number says, I calculated this, I have a rationale. The second forces the other party to be more careful because they're wondering, why did he say $487,500 and not $500,000?
Exactly. Mason's research frames this as a competence signal. A precise number creates the impression of a researched, calculated offer, which makes the other party more cautious. But there's a critical warning.
Let me give that warning. There has to be a real rationale behind the precise number. In one negotiation, I said $87,250, and the other party immediately asked, why exactly that number? If I don't have an answer, that precision comes back at me like a boomerang.
And that's exactly the full finding of the research. A precise number is a strong anchor, but undefended precision is far more dangerous than a defended round number because you signaled competence and then your competence was challenged.
And that leads us to the counter-anchoring issue. Say a competitor gave a lower offer and the client told you. The most common mistake? Getting defensive and offering a discount. That means stepping inside the anchor the competitor set.
Galinsky and Mussweiler call this surrendering to the anchor effect. The other party's number unconsciously becomes your reference point. What you need to do is break that frame.
In practice, here's how I do it. I say, before we can compare our price to our competitors, we need to clarify the scope first. That single sentence moves the negotiation from the price axis to the scope axis. And on the scope axis, I'm in a much stronger position because I'm the one narrating the value of my own offer. That's exactly what Perlmutter did to Disney. He moved the cash payment debate to the equity structure debate. The axis shifted, and on the new axis, Perlmutter's conditions prevailed.
So far, we've established the first offer is a powerful anchor, but not unconditionally. The question is, how do you make this call when you sit down at the table? The most decisive question I've found in the field is this: can I walk away from this negotiation? And if I do, does my life continue? If the answer is yes, speak first.
In research language, that question translates to, what is the strength of your alternatives? Fisher, Uri, and Patton's Getting to Yes calls this BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If your alternative is strong, dropping the first anchor is an advantage. If it isn't, waiting is the smarter move.
Second criterion, information asymmetry. My argument here, if you don't have enough information about the other party, the anchor you drop will either trap you with a ceiling that's too low or walk the other party. Galinsky's research describes this as the blind anchor risk.
And the third criterion, the intersection of those two, is anxiety level. Moravi and Heller's research proves this. Negotiators with weak alternatives who are also anxious quote numbers below their own expectations when they make the first offer. Anxiety pushes numbers down. In this condition, speaking second produces far better outcomes.
I'd add a fourth criterion as essential. Is this negotiation one-time or relational? In long-term partnerships, I avoid very aggressive anchors. You might gain an economic advantage at the first table, but the dissatisfaction you leave behind weakens you at the second table.
That maps directly onto the meta-analysis finding. Economic value and subjective satisfaction are inversely proportional. Iger struck this balance, and $4 billion, given Marvel's subsequent value, turned out to be extraordinarily cheap.
Then let's build the decision tree. Strong alternative plus sufficient information. Speak first. Use a precise number. Have a rationale you can defend. Weak alternative or insufficient information. Listen first. Try to understand the other party's alternatives and motivations, then position. One-time deal, you can open more aggressively. Long-term relationship, build the frame yourself, but place the number carefully.
And a rule that holds in every scenario. Before you sit down, know three things: your own strongest alternatives, the other party's likely alternatives, and the range within which a deal is possible, the zone where both parties can say yes. If you know that range, you place your anchor not at the edge of it, but beyond, at a point you can still defend.
Let's go back to Disney Marvel. Did Disney miscalculate that range?
Almost certainly. According to Deadline.com's detailed reporting from the period, Disney's due diligence team could see that Marvel wasn't under financial pressure. They knew Perlmutter didn't have to sell, and still, they couldn't break that frame.
Because once Iger understood Perlmutter's real motivation, I don't want to retire, I love Marvel, he shifted strategy from price battle to relationship building. And with that decision, he ceded the price frame to Perlmutter.
Relationship building sometimes outweighs the price fight, but when it's a conscious choice, it's strength. When it happens without awareness, it's a loss.
In our previous video, we talked about how Apple put $999 on screen at the iPad launch, then switched to $499, and sales hit 5 times what analysts projected. To me, that's the mass audience version of the anchor strategy applied at a negotiation table.
Same mechanism, different context. In a negotiation, you state the reference point. At a launch, the reference point had already been built by media expectations. A tablet can't come in below $1,000. Jobs used that anchor, crushed it, and placed his own. Perlmutter's "I don't want to sell" served the same function. It established an expectation frame in advance.
And let me add, we saw the same thing in the Williams-Sonoma case. When you place a second product next to the first, the perception of the first product changes. In negotiation, we can call this a bundle anchor.
When you present a package with multiple variables, price, payment terms, warranty period, instead of a single number, price becomes just one piece of that package.
And that's a very effective tactic. It creates a wider reference frame in the other party's mind. Perlmutter did this with the pay in equity condition. He moved the price debate into a payment structure debate. Disney ended up conceding on both the price band and the payment structure. Perlmutter's conditions prevailed.
So the winners in negotiation aren't just the ones who quote the better number, they're the ones who define the axis the negotiation turns on.
And that axis is most often set by the frame the first speaker lays down. When strong alternatives, sufficient information, and the right moment converge, speaking first is an unambiguous advantage. When those conditions aren't in place, build the frame, but hold the number.
Let's close the loop. Disney bought Marvel for $4 billion. But Perlmutter was the one who set the frame, dropped the anchor, and defined the axis the negotiation turned on. The first offer didn't come from Disney. The first speaker was Perlmutter, and the deal closed at the reference point he had placed.
And let's add this. The long-term consequence of that decision far exceeded the initial price. The value Marvel created inside Disney multiplied those $4 billion many times over. So Iger's decision to prioritize the relationship over the price battle was, in retrospect, exactly the right calculation.
3 takeaways from this video. First, the power of the first offer is real and proven, but not unconditional. Second, the strength of your alternatives, information asymmetry, and anxiety level determine the first or second decision. Third, how the number is said and how it's framed is just as critical as the number itself.
Now it's your turn. Think about your next negotiation table. Where do your alternatives stand? Do you know enough about the other party? Are you going to speak first, go second, or quietly build the frame? Share your answer in the comments. Let's analyze real scenarios together.
If this content added value to you, the like and subscribe buttons help this channel reach more viewers. Both are free, both compound.
The anchoring mechanism we talked about in this video, how price is perceived, how a reference point shapes value, we worked through all of that with the Apple, Williams-Sonoma, and The Economist cases in our The Sales Equation video. If you want to fully understand the anchor Perlmutter dropped, I'd recommend watching that one. Link is below.
And if you want to go deeper on what it means to negotiate from a position of strength, how restricting access creates value, and why the ability to say no is the most expensive marketing strategy there is, our The Scarcity Paradox video puts exactly that dynamic on the table through the Hermes and Rolex cases. Before you think about what speaking first will get you without a strong alternative in place, watch that one. Link is below as well.
See you next time.